Let's go to the CLAL. So welcome one and all, and welcome Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, dear friend, spirit friend, and president of CLAL, the Center for Learning and Leadership in New York City. He and I have been about collaborations for almost 10 years now.
Yeah,
maybe even over a little bit. And so we finished doing some work this past month, and there were lots of conversations that I realized would be really helpful for the start of this course. So to follow that's a little bit. You'll hear more about me in the introductory forum. But just invite Rabbi Brad to introduce himself a little bit, and then we'll get started in this particular conversation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hess. Yeah, Lisa has been a colleague and teacher and a friend for at least a decade. And even though I can't be there physically, even to see all of you, I feel genuinely blessed to be a part of this process. For me, there has probably never been a time when our country needed religious leaders and religious leadership more. And we need a certain kind of religious leadership, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me it's not only a religious question, it's a social question, it's a political question, that we often seem to be divided between people of deep conviction and principle and people who really live their answers deeply, but they're often really shut down to other possibilities. They're quite closed and siloed, is a word we hear a lot. And then we have people who know, oh my gosh, I don't want to be siloed. No, that would be terrible. And then you ask people, what are your real animating commitments? And they scratch their head. They actually can't point to the particulars in their lives where they live out their most deeply held beliefs, assuming they have them. And so for me, the stakes on this are, is it possible to raise up a generation of people who are simultaneously profoundly committed and genuinely open? For me, this is nothing less than a sacred laboratory for doing that. So yeah, I feel blessed to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Brad. So to set up the context, both of us really want to start with where we are. So I'm going to tell a story, and that means where I am, where he is, and where you are collectively, but also, in this course in the seminary, but also individually and collectively in your ministry life. The place that I really learned this up front and close was, I don't know, it was probably about 7 years ago. And Brad was going to be coming to the Dayton area to speak at Stillwater Methodist Church, a little bit north of campus. And so we were having some conversations about how that might go. And me being me, I love to build bridges. I love to find what is animating in the community or the person across the fence, and find how that connects intimately and deeply to my, deep commitments. And then, so anyway, I was doing a lot of work trying to find what that might be. So maybe we should talk about prayer, or maybe we should talk about observance, because that's how the language, or maybe, anyway, so I was doing a lot of work. He finally just said, okay, Lisa, that all sounds interesting, but what question or what questions will they be coming with? And I startled, because I had been running from that a little bit. I knew exactly what the questions would be that this particular congregation would be coming with, which is, why do you not think that Jesus is your Lord and Savior? So I just told him, I said, that's going to be the question they come in with. And Brad said, well, why don't we start there? we both laughed, and I was doing a protective hostess thing. And, I'm very aware that Brad is, his background is modern Orthodox rabbinic Judaism. And a lot of the people coming in were not going to know anything. I wanted to protect them from ignorant questions that might embarrass them or hurt him, or, oh my gosh, I was just all in that. And he said, so why don't we just start with that? And so we began to have that conversation, and it was such an opening. And so anyway, he did come, and it was one of the most generative conversations that I've gotten a chance to experience in a Christian congregation that could be fully who they are and fully with their deep commitments and have a conversation that nobody was afraid to have. Well, they might have been, they might have had some of the reaction that I had as we began. But as you open into the space, and particularly given some of the work that we're going to be doing in this semester, there's an invitation into a way where that none of that has to be at play. So we want to start with where we are. So anyway, Brad, do you have anything that you would like to name about that story?
Yeah, I mean, I love that story because it was incredibly protective, by the way, not just of me, but of an entire church community that Lisa was practicing, right? To protect me from the discomfort of, hey, dude, what's your problem, right? God sent his son into the world. You seem to still be resisting this 2,000 years later. Grow up. And trying to protect me from that. And I don't need to be protected from that. And we can talk later if you want about why Jesus Christ is not my Lord and Savior, but I have no problem lifting up the very real, not just possibility, but fact that he is yours. And maybe we'll talk, but also protecting, the church membership from, asking what quote would be embarrassing questions. And I remember Lisa saying, I was like, wow, that is so incredibly sensitive, much more sensitive than I would ever be, frankly. But more significantly, I couldn't imagine anyone asking a question that would embarrass them, because the less you know, the more brave it is for you to come into church and listen to some rabbi. So the amazing thing is that the person who can ask the sophisticated question, they might get into trouble because you should really know better than that. But the person who doesn't know and still comes out for that evening, that's a kind of spiritual heroism. Mm-hmm. Because for me, it's not about trying to be together, being less of who we are in order to make that possible. Yeah. That's a disastrous recipe in my view. It's how can we be more of who we are and still be there together, even when that moreness doesn't always fit so well. And it won't always work. But let's at least start with where we are. And if you want, we can talk about why, for me, that's actually a very Bible-based approach to encounter, even if it isn't always comfortable. But, maybe that's one of the gifts that faith should allow us to be in the places that aren't always comfortable for us. And, let us be there together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So we began exploring a little bit of what we call the elephant in the room. And I'm going to name what is a sort of a classical framework for understanding this particular area of inquiry for this particular semester course. You're going to hear these terms over the course of the 12 weeks. They will begin to make more and more sense, and the nuances will come. So don't worry if it doesn't all crystallize at this point. But over probably the last 120 years, although you could make arguments from other historical eras and other cultural settings, but for our intents and purposes, the classical framework that this area of disciplinary inquiry deals with is the exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralist framework. It's a threefold framework. It's a bit of how the conversations seem to unfold as post-Shoah, post-Holocaust, there was a whole lot more awareness of we need to be attentive to one another in very different ways than we are right now. And so there were, so the conversations beginning tended to look at those who were exclusive of their tradition would replace all others. Inclusivists who really were interested in a much more expansive way of being in the world, wanting to include all voices, to learn from all voices. And then pluralist, which is recognizing the world is a very complicated place full of difference, created by God to be full of difference. But how do we recognize that and honor that that is the created reality? Now, the pluralist is where we'll spend some time in this course, but it's neither inclusivist, that everybody should have a voice, nor is it relativistic, that everything is the same. One of the great parts in my own journey in this was being introduced to CLAL through a dear friend of ours, Rabbi Erwin Kula, who then introduced me to Rabbi Brad, and the founder of their community developed a phrase called principled pluralism. So I want to just putting those names into the room. And Yitz Greenberg is Irving is the published name, but there will be a PDF article that you'll get to read of his. But having put those terms into the soup and those names, I'll just turn to Brad for how, what did you hear and how do you hold this? Because you're the ones who sort of gave me some good language for this.
Okay, so I'll try and not mess up whatever good we've managed to accomplish. And let's revisit for a minute, right, the exclusivist, which I don't think is nearly necessarily as problematic as it's often thought of.
Mm-hmm.
The inclusivist, which is never as inclusive as the inclusivist thing, because everyone
Yes.
gets to their limits.
Right.
I'm not opposed to inclusivism as a strategy in connecting with people. And if in fact we can include each other, that's great. Though I'm always a little suspicious, but if we can include each other that readily, we probably were like to begin with, and there's no great discovery going on. But okay, sometimes there is, and that's fine. But I want to be clear, every act of inclusion will also exclude. Right? I love hearing about big tent this and big tent that. But the truth is, I don't care how big your tent is, it won't fit everybody. You don't want it to fit everybody. You don't want to be with everybody. No one does. So, which moves us toward pluralism, which is in some way not about building bigger tents, but about imagining we live on a shared campground. Mm. And sometimes we inhabit the same tent. Sometimes we visit each other's tents, though they're quite distinct one to the other. And sometimes, like, I know that tent exists, but I don't really want to even visit it. I don't want them to visit me. On the other hand, I don't feel a need to burn down their tent or drive them off the campground. Mm. Pluralism, when it's a principle pluralism, right? Because I don't mean as a survival strategy, right? We live in a big world, a democratic culture, we've got to put up with each other. Though even there, and I spent a lot of years resisting the term tolerance because it seems so low level to me. And I didn't use a theological frame. I would often ask audiences who like they liked the word tolerance. And I would say, really? If I got up here and told you my goal for Black people and white people in America is for us to tolerate each other, how good would that feel? I mean, I feel like I need a shower. So, and then I still think it's true. I think it's a relatively low bar, though given the state of the world today. I also want to be honest, someone who finds me intolerable and can find within their heart and mind the ability to tolerate me, that's actually a big move. That's a very big move. And it may not rise to the level of a principled pluralism, but it has its role to play. So here, the first thing is that when it comes to exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, I think we need them all at different times. I don't think it's which is right. I incline toward principled pluralism, and I'll explain why in a second. But I think all of us at different times will draw on all of them, and that's totally fine. And in fact, when the inclusivists say to the pluralists, you know, you're really relativist, and that's very dangerous. And to the exclusivists, you're really mean-spirited medieval morons. I always point out, wow, you're a funny kind of inclusivist because you can include everyone who already thinks like you. But what about the people who are more radical than you or more theologically conservative than you? Somehow they didn't get included. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to leave room for all of these, not as endpoints, but as tools, intellectual, spiritual, theological tools that we have to be able to use in our ministries. And different people will need different ones at different times.
I like that.
And that was a long answer. If you want the theological part of why I do incline toward pluralism, just say go on, and I'll do 2 more minutes about that.
Yeah, do more on pluralism.
Okay, so, and ironically, it is precisely because I'm a relatively theologically conservative person that I am a pluralist. I really do believe in an infinite God who has given our communities infinite gifts. I also believe that we are each finite. So imagine that each of us is an 8-ounce cup drawing water from an infinite spring. If the spring only had 8 ounces, then I would say my cup better hold all 8. But if the spring is infinite, and I really do believe that for me, the Hebrew Bible and all resulting Jewish tradition is the infinite gift of an infinite God. Yes, personal God. Yes, revelation. All the stuff that progressives, their skin starts to itch, right? I really believe that stuff. And I don't only believe it about my tradition. I believe it about my tradition for me. I believe it about your tradition. I believe that an infinite God in her, his, its, their infinite love gifted the world with another infinite gift called the New Testament and all subsequent Christian tradition. But we are finite. And so we can only hold a finite amount of God's infinite wisdom and love. And that's what gives rise to the pluralism. I can't include all that God has offered unless I think I'm God. And I'm not. I'm a finite created image of God, as Genesis 1:27 tells us. But the image is not the thing, and the created is not the creator. So for me, the more theologically traditional one is, the more naturally one will embrace the intellectual posture. I've never said it this way before. I'm not sure I'm going to believe it after we're done, but for right now, the intellectual and spiritual posture of a principled pluralist, the social and political posture of an inclusivist, and the lifestyle and practice of an exclusivist.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So this is where we're going. I really appreciate the invitation for tools or strategies, and it doesn't signal a lack of integrity. It signals a what in the syllabus language I name the surrender to the sovereignty of God, that there are different leadings at different times in our lives. Different communities call forth different gifts from us at different times in our lives. And so learning to really move with what I will call the Trinitarian flow, the movement of spirit, and identifying the visceral, sensate, intellectual, spiritual, emotional sensitivities to be able to discern spirit's leadings in those ways, really then lends to what tool is required at this point. And there's always, well, at least in the times that I've taught this course, there's always this sort of, determination of Dr. Hess must be X. Because of, she must hold this as a model, she must hold this as a model. And I'm always fascinated by that because although I really respect and move within the theological disciplinary streams of thought, I don't choose one. There are those that I lean into at different times. And so that's why it's very confusing for students. And I think that's actually makes it a helpful reminder right from the very beginning about strategies. So one of the ways that I also describe the start of the course, sort of moving into the specific start where we are pieces now, is that, so what are the elephants in the room? Another image that I've used, which mixes our metaphor, but I'm okay with that, is I often experience students coming into the course about interreligious and intercultural encounter, loaded for bear is the phrase that I'll use. And I get it. The way that this area of inquiry has been framed for so long in silos is that this is the place where you're going to lose your faith. This is the place where you're going to lose your Jesus. And so I will say here and twice on Tuesdays and till I'm out of breath through the end of the 12 weeks, that is not, I never want any student to lose their Jesus ever, because that, there's, now you may be challenged with a different face of Jesus than you ever experienced before. That doesn't count as losing. So what is the invitation? So what is the invitation to growth is underneath some of this for me. So I'm aware of sometimes that question in the room of, will this course result in me betraying my faith? And that's a serious question that I hold with a heartbreak and a heartache. So I want to name that one. In talking with Brad before we started this, I have an elephant in the room also, being in the world that we're in today, where the more rigid habits of mind that human beings can bring into a complicated conversation. I have a real sadness and fear about that in our communities today. So to state it plainly, I think there is an internal and an external violence that can come with an unthinking exclusivism. And that is my elephant in the room. I do not want any United graduate to be a part of conceptual violence in communities or actual violence in communities. And our configuration of Christianity today in denominational expressions, there are a lot of ways where the wheels are coming off. And there are some real issues that religious leaders need to be grounded in our historic faith and the scandal of who Christ is in the world and what the power of the Spirit can offer when you're in the flow of Spirit, not when you think you have Spirit and you're doing this, but when you're in the midst of something that you can't but do because you're in the flow of it. And so it's trying to invite that kind of integrative learning that I love this course for. And my elephant in the room is I don't want anybody who leaves this course to be an unthinking, and a sort of unaware, conceptually violent exclusivist. That's what I don't want. You can be exclusivist. You can be, because I use that sometimes too. It's the unthinking out of fear or anxiety, or stubbornness. I'm stubborn, but it's that posture of spirit that I'm really concerned about in our world today. So anyway, those are the elephants that I know. Brad, I'll comment, or your elephants.
Yeah, I quickly on both. First of all, I think that the willingness to name our different elephants is already the correction, or the beginning of the correction on the elephant stampeding.
Yes.
Right? Most people who say this is what I am going to be sensitive to, or I am in fear of, tend to be able to work with that fear, not to have to protect against it and not to succumb to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what you're doing is important, because it's as I said to you before we started recording, I said, yeah, I think the real issue with there isn't the elephant in the room, there are multiple elephants in the room, and they often charge past each other. And so here the real issue is, let's see if we can keep them not from having to be down to one elephant, and not for them to charge past each other, but for not to get them stampeding. Because when those elephants start to get stampede, then a lot of people get squashed underneath them, often unwittingly. So I love when you talk about being thinkingly whatever comes next. And so I guess there's two things is, how do any of us, you, I, the students who are gathered with us here, how do you know when you're surrendering to the sovereignty of God, as opposed to, dare I say it, surrendering to the sovereignty of ourselves? Mm-hmm. Now, since I should probably answer the question I posed, I'm going to play fair, and it speaks to what you said. My willingness to be surprised is how I know I'm surrendering to the sovereignty of God.
Mm.
If the God I am hearing, remember, I'm the guy who believes in actual revelation to actual people. If my understanding of that gift, if my faith is in a God who only and always confirms and affirms what I currently believe, that's a really small God and a really small gift. So again, the funny thing is, what's often the language that's taken by people who aren't so traditional in the thought and practice, I don't think it makes sense for them. They should just do enough research, figure out what the God who's a finite God wants from them, and do that and be done. But if we really believe in this infinite creator and gifter, then again, it's not to be in a constant state of tumult, right? Because God also, I believe, loves us and comforts us and holds us. But if we're not at least sometimes saying like, oh my God, I never thought that before. If we're not willing to be surprised, it seems to me that's the shrinking of faith, not the expansion of faith. What would it be like to dare to be surprised, but not to be diluted? And of course, if we're dealing with an infinite resource, the one thing you can never do to something infinite is dilute it. It's not dilutable by definition if it's truly infinite. And so I think that that's, at least for me, one of the ways I know if I'm surrendering to the sovereignty of God is the willingness to be surprised, to rethink, to revisit, not to throw it all up in the air and say, who's to know? That's relativism. I don't believe in that. But the willingness to be engaged with people and to be willing to imagine being surprised and even feeling surprised, even if it brings me back to the place I started. Because we will be back in the place we started, having seen and felt and heard different things. And that opens our hearts and our minds and our souls. So that's my test of surrender to the sovereignty of God. It is both absolutely demanding and genuinely surprising, at least from time to time. Not every day, because I couldn't handle that, but at least from time to time.
Yes. Yes. So a couple, before we wind down, there's one, this course invites us into some deepening of this kind of reflection with different tools and strategies of how to be in a pluralistic world and be deeply rooted in your own tradition. But that also means through some practices and through some of the ways we engage the material that we'll be encountering boundaries and borders. So one of the ways that I've named this, and it's usually an implicit thing with one of the practices that you'll engage for a week in particular, but there is this opportunity to practice what is your experience of discernment of boundaries, discernment of where you can't here and you can't go any further because it either feels up here or whatever the experience of it is. And so as we were talking, Brad said, oh, yeah, I've got a thing on borders and boundaries that sometimes can enliven and give a good picture for it. And it really did for me as he named it. So I'm going to invite both that this course is heading for, you'll be at boundaries and borders, and those are good things. But you do have decisions to make when you're at those borders. So Brad.
So I think that's what Dr. Hess just said is the key. And it's not about what's the border or boundary, because however many people are on part of this course now, including the two of us, we all have our sets of borders and boundaries. And the one that looks to me like an absolute border or boundary looks to someone else like a permeable one. Someone else goes, that's not a border or boundary at all. The only thing I will say is that people who say they have no borders or boundaries, run, don't walk. Right? Those are scary people.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what a perverse or perverted inclusivism ends up generating. And it leads to a kind of intellectual and, God help us, moral paralysis that I don't think is appropriate.
Yeah.
But I live keenly aware that what is an absolute border for me, someone else might go, really? That's the thing you can't cross over. And so what is true in every one of those settings is now tell me about the border or the boundary. It's interesting as far as it goes. Tell me who you want to be when you come to yours.
Mm.
Because that's a choice every one of us gets to make. And I'll share 4 that I think are available to us. It's not an exhaustive list. It's kind of the ones I work with. And again, I'm not suggesting any one of them is better than the others, but that they're all there for us to choose. You come to a border and you go, I know who I am. I'm the Border Patrol. Those are aliens, alien ideas, alien people, alien values. And the best and healthiest thing I can do is make sure they don't come in to our sacred community. I'm the Border Patrol. And again, if everyone here hasn't at least experienced that at some point, I would be a little nervous. You might come to a certain border or boundary and say, I don't think that I need to be the border police here. I'm going to be a crossing guard. I can help people from where we are to go over there. I don't want to go there particularly. It's not for me, but I can look at this person who needs to cross over and I can be helpful to them in that. That I can do. I'm not going with them. It's not my place. It's not my space, but I see them. I see their needs. I see their faith. I can help them cross over. I can be an evangelist. I can call out with a full heart and a full head. Literally, I have the good news and I want to share it with you. So I am an evangelist. And the 4th posture is I can be a frontier scout. I can know pretty much where my base camp is. And I'm actually not interested in changing it. But I'm genuinely curious about what's out there on the frontier. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to do what all scouts do. I'm going to study. I'm going to learn. I'm going to evaluate. And I'm going to bring those insights and experiences back to my base camp. Mm-hmm. What will we do with them? I don't know. We make a, wow, we got to tighten the Border Patrol. Maybe. Wow, we need to build more crosswalks and have better crossing guards. Wow, we better be better evangelists because it's like scary out there. Or we may need to build a scouting culture in which more people can imagine I can venture out onto the frontier and learn from it without eroding my love and commitment to my base camp one iota. Those are all choices we can make.
Yeah. So as we do draw this to a close, one of the questions that has come up in the last several times that I've taught this course, I finally just decided, maybe in terms of how students teach me what's going on with them and how questions are rising up in more collective communities that come to our seminary. And so what is my responsibility? I decided to revise the course a bit and bring in another text that we will discuss next week. Brad and I will have another conversation for you next week. And the question that really drew it was, will this course make me a better evangelist? And given that I'm Presbyterian, Presbyterians are not quite renowned for their evangelism. We're a very quiet bunch. So when I first heard the question, probably 4 classes ago, I remember thinking, okay, all right, so how to hold the question and really invite conversation about it. And then it came again the second, and then the third, and then as it started to repeat, I was like, okay, there was a little part of me that was starting to get irritated. because it was hitting my elephant, you know. And then there was a part of me that was also deeply appreciative of the consistency of the question, and that there must be something there. There must be something there for me to learn, and also something that the community as a whole, the collective, Protestant Christians that are coming to United Seminary, I'll just put it because we're such a diverse community, but in Christian sense, but that there must be something that Spirit's inviting us all to engage with more intention. So next week we will we'll have a discussion on Brian Stone's book, but more, I mean, his book will inform our discussion, but it's particularly important, both the question, but also the context, for us to really listen historically to some of how that question has been engaged, and some of the reason my elephant's in the room, some of the violence that's because of that question, or understandings of evangelism. But also to just really open up the discussion and see what happens. I don't really even know how our conversation will go, but I know this space, and I trust Brad, and I love finding out what we're going to learn. So that's what we will begin to engage next week. And Brad, if there are closing comments or things you'd like to say with respect to that, give you the floor for that. And then
look, that's its own conversation. I will just say that if you feel called to be a better evangelist, I hope this class will in fact make you one. And how it is that a Jew can say that, even though he has no intention of becoming Christian, we'll talk about. And what you mean by a better evangelist, I hope, is something you'll begin to think about, because I think there are a lot of ways to be a better evangelist. Maybe most important, since it literally means to be a bearer of good news, to invite you to think about, what is the good news that you carry?
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And